Thank you, Kate, Fiona, for the worship this morning. And all the worship. I want to begin this morning by reading another extract from The Winter Vault, the book I read from yesterday by Anne Michaels. And this passage is from a bit later on in the book, and it's talking about the rebuilding of the ruined city of Warsaw. The clatter was usually followed by the rustling of newspapers, said Lucian, as people took their Karpa Warszawska from their pockets, a weekly magazine, Janina, that kept us up to date on the progress of the rebuilding. After the war, so many newspapers sprouted up right away, 5 or 6 daily papers. We couldn't hear enough about how well we were doing. 200,000 cubic metres of rubble removed by the horse-drawn carts, 60 kilometres of streets cleared of debris, 1,000 buildings cleared of mines. Comrades, said Ranger, work has commenced on the market square, on the tin roof of the palace, on the church on Leszno Street. The library has now opened on Recien Street. Pilgrims converged at the same locations, the same square meters of rubble, each person mourning a different loss. The mourners stood together in the same spot and wept for their various dead, for Jews, Poles, soldiers, civilians, ghetto fighters, home army officers, dozens of allegiances buried in the same heap of stones. How does a city rebuild itself? Said Lucian. Within days, someone sets out pots amid the rubble and opens a florist's shop. A few days after that, someone puts a plank between 2 bricks and opens a bookshop. In London, after the bombings, said Jean, willow herb took root and spread through the ruins. Janina, said Lucian, this isn't our romance. I'm not talking about wildflowers. I'm talking about commerce. That's how you rebuild a city. You can have all the wildflowers you want, but in the end, someone must open up a shop. I love the sheer practicality of this passage. It reminds me of a poem I first heard from Helen Stephen, who was the justice and peace worker of the Arabic community. For many years she was a Quaker, and this is a poem by Adrienne Rich. I'm getting lots of feedback here.
I think someone's unmuted themselves, it sounds like.
Sorry, it's me checking it. I'll stop doing that. I'll switch it off. I apologize.
My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. We are always having to reconstitute the world. The 19th century Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard said, faith is to walk out over 50,000 fathoms of water. Mostly, the storms we ourselves face are not at sea, unless we are sailors or fishermen or have made refugee journeys. The storms are in our hearts and minds, in the rage of anger, the turbulence of fear, the conflict around us, the panic within us. They happen when we feel ourselves cast adrift with no direction, no support, no safe harbour. The last thing we expect or want to do is walk on water. To understand our faith as trust, risk, daring, doing. And yet Jesus' call to Peter, come on, is an invitation to live out of our faith, not out of our fear. When I worked for Christian Aid, as we launched humanitarian fundraising appeals, drafted statements, petitioned governments, and sought to bring life-saving assistance to our global partners, the story increasingly seemed like a powerful metaphor for the chaos threatening to overwhelm life in so many places. In the storm and the struggle, it seems as if we are going nowhere, battling against the elements, forces which seem too powerful to overcome, not even just the might of arms or armies, but of despair, anguish, suffering and hatred. Still, it has seemed to me most important to keep faith with all those on the margins who are caught in a storm that is not just spiritual but material, not just personal but political. To act despite our fear, to persist in hope, to stand for justice, to pray for peace in the midst of such outrage and suffering is truly a call to walk on water. To listen, to be in solidarity, to offer encouragement must lead us to speak out clearly ourselves, to centre the voices of those not heard, to act with courage and not to settle for sticking plaster to cover over the wounds. We are often tempted to keep quiet or to avoid problems for ourselves. To do that would be faithless, to display little faith when others are having to exercise almost unbelievable faith and hope and love. Come on, it's the call of Jesus to all of us also. And in the midst of our struggles is Jesus, the teacher from Galilee, saying, do not be afraid. These words do not come from someone who had a comfortable life, an easy faith, and a peaceful death. They come from someone who knew fear, loneliness, and desolation. Someone who wept and suffered and struggled, and at the end knew great doubt. Any ability to bend and bind the elements was of no significance then. What mattered was not what he could bind, but what he had bound himself to. Of his own free choice, Jesus bound himself to suffering humanity, to the poor and outcast of the world, to the way not of power but of love, of peace and not of violence. And at the heart of these, his binding of himself in trust to the mystery of the divine love, which would always be faithful. I want to talk a little about kayaking, which is something I do really badly. I grew up with a dominant message from my background: if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing well. It's not the only message I got from my upbringing, but it was a powerful one. And so I learned to do quite a few things well. This isn't something I regret. The desire to do things well taught me a measure of discipline and application. I have had a great deal of enjoyment from doing them, and a lot of the pleasure has come from doing them with other people. But I came to realise that this message was an incomplete one. A few years ago, I was talking to a colleague about a piece of work we were both involved in, which I felt was not reaching a high enough standard. I said to her, as people had said to me, if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing well. She looked at me rather quizzically and replied, but surely, if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. I was stunned. No one had ever said anything like this to me before. I apologise to all of you who have always known this for how pathetic I must sound. But this was the force of a revelation to me. It had genuinely never occurred to me before that the pursuit of excellence might not be the highest value in every task. If a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing for its own sake. After she said that, I thought about it a great deal, and I realised a number of rather sobering facts. I realised I had a story about myself that was in some ways quite restrictive, because I was too busy carrying the burden of perfection. I don't think it was all about fear of failure, though of course that was in there as well. It was more about thinking that this was the right way to be. Wasn't it Jesus, after all, who called us to be perfect? Wasn't that what the parable of the talents was all about? And I also realised that in my carrying of the burden of perfection, I was harder on myself than on anyone else. Now, grappling with the novel concept that if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing badly, I realised there was a hook I had to let myself off, which brings me to kayaking. I happened to be at the Area Communities Outdoor Centre at Camas on the island of Mull, and someone asked me if I'd like to try kayaking. Well, I really didn't think I would at all, it was my immediate reaction. But I caught myself just in time, glimpsed an instinct just disappearing round a corner of my mind that said yes, pulled it back and said aloud, yes. 30 minutes later, I had been zipped with some difficulty into an embarrassingly tight wetsuit, wedged into an even tighter kayak, from which I thought I would probably never be able to extricate myself, and pushed off into a very cold bay where I was now sitting on top of the water, cursing my own stupidity. For a while I was very miserable indeed. I couldn't get the hang of paddling. I was terrified I was going to roll over, and the thought that I might never get up or out again and would drown wasn't nearly so bad as the thought that I would certainly fall in and get my head wet. But the person who was instructing us was very good and very encouraging. Gradually, I began to be more comfortable and to give myself up to what I was doing, to realise that things, even quite large things like me and my kayak, actually floated in the sea. Suddenly, I realised that I was enjoying myself without any claims to competence whatsoever. I was having a wonderful time. I'm pleased to tell you that I am still, and probably always will be, a hopeless kayaker. I still can't paddle properly, and I wouldn't be safe out on my own, even in a sheltered bay. Nevertheless, I love doing it. I love being on the sea, feeling it support me. I have learned that if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And if there are any others among you who carry the burden of perfection, I invite you to concentrate more on the possibilities than on the performance. I give you permission to fail and encouragement to try again, to live out of your freedom instead of your fear. That may mean asking for help. There are people who know from experience the basic survival skills and pass them on, who will tread water beside you and help calm the sheer panic. People who will say, yes, you can do it, and eventually, yes, there are strange and beautiful things to discover. Shells that might have corals in them, even under 50 feet of water. But you have to be prepared to shout for help. When you're drowning, it's no time to be polite. A stiff upper lip will not keep you afloat. When you're in the sea and it's very dark and very stormy and very cold, and actually you think you're drowning and you're very scared, and you see a piece of wood drifting by in the middle distance, you don't hang around to ask questions or to speculate about how it got there and why and who sent it. You just swim as hard as you can towards it, and you grab it and cling on for dear life. In the back of your mind, you know it's not a boat, and it will not give you either direction or control. You're still at the mercy of the flood tide, and whether you like it or not, you're going where it takes you. But to be honest, you don't care. You just want not to drown, and the wood offers hope, support, a bit of respite for your aching arms and back, a feeling of not being completely abandoned, something solid to hold on to in the midst of all this insubstantial water and dark and wind, and stop you panicking, a way to give yourself up to the sea. I haven't reached dry land yet, but I'm in sight of the shore. The piece of wood is still with me, and it's funny, but I've got to kind of like being in the water. Of course, it's easier to say that when you can see land. I believe my best hope of being human, of recognizing myself as a member of a species among species, of living creatively with change, and of making necessary changes in my own life, lies in naming and cherishing the things that nurture and sustain me personally. For me, these include music, gardening, the landscape and literature of Scotland. They include my dear ones, my friends and family, solitude, my grandchildren especially, and I love trees planted by water. You may have also noticed that I love poetry. Poetry has many attractions for many people, but for me, the reason I love it more than any other kind of writing is because I feel it through my feet. Because it's rhythmic. I feel it in my body, and because it starts in my feet, it connects me to the earth. And I feel it through my feet in a way that is different from prose. Recently, I was at the opening concert of the Edinburgh Festival, whose theme this year was Rituals That Unite Us. Osvaldo Golijov's La Patience égale San Marcos is almost a quarter of a century old now. It was commissioned as one of 4 new passions in 2000 by the EU to mark the 250th anniversary of the death of Bach. But its treatment of the gospel still came as a shock. A riot of rhythm and colour, interweaving a variety of Latin American musical styles and cultural and dance traditions. This was Christ's suffering, not as solemn biblical narrative, but as a here and now human crisis, one told, retold, and reenacted by the masses in language drawn from Spanish vernacular gospel pamphlets sold on street corners. A St. Mark's Passion in which choristers gesticulated in anger, soloists swayed in rhythm, or Christ's crucifixion was conveyed through capoeira would doubtless raise eyebrows, but in Golijov's prismatic interpretation, and when delivered with such conviction, that intertwining of music and movement felt utterly natural. It was one of the most embodied rituals I had ever taken part in. It united the packed Usher Hall, which gave it a 10-minute standing ovation. The loveliness is everywhere, even in the ugliest and most hostile environment. The loveliness is everywhere, at the turning of a corner, in the eyes and on the lips of a stranger, in the emptiest areas where is no place for hope and only death invites the heart. The loveliness is there. It emerges, incomprehensible, inexplicable. It rises in its own reality. And what we must learn is how to receive it into ours. It's one of my favourite poems by the Scottish-French writer Kenneth White. Friendship, being alongside people, enjoying one another's company, happens whenever people share meals, watch through long nights with others, bear witness for them in bureaucracies, prepare food for those too weary or ill or despairing to do it themselves, look after the children for a while, get the shopping in, or simply offer an encouraging word or smile or hug or shoulder to lean on. It happens when people respect one another's wishes, preserve their confidences, protect their need for solitude or privacy, refrain from telling them how to solve their problems or live their lives. This solidarity of presence and compassion is costly, practical, undemonstrative, and not the particular preserve of Christians or of any one nationality or culture. It is perhaps the best flowering of our mutual humanity, the highest regard that human beings can offer one another. It is the loveliness that is everywhere. I want to end with a couple of poems, and I think that we have a poem from R.S. Thomas. Who's got the poem? Yes. Would you like to come and? Yes. Any poem up by R.S. Thomas, the Welsh poet, is worth hearing.
By coincidence, I was sent this poem just the day before I set off to come here. And when I read it, I thought this poem embodies what we're doing here. Some of you may know it. It's by R.S. Thomas, the Welsh poet, who hung on to his faith, I think you might say, by his fingernails, as many of us do here, I think. And it's called The Listener in the Corner. Last night, the talk was of the relationship of the self to God. Tonight, God to the self. The sanctuaries yawn. Alone in the corner, one sits, whose silence persuades of the pointlessness of the discourse. He drinks at another fountain that builds itself equally from the dust of ruffians and saints. Outside, the wind howls. The stars that once were the illuminated city of the imagination, to him are fires extinguished for the eye's lenses formed. The universe is a large place, with more of darkness than light, but slowly a web is spun there, as minds like his swing themselves to and fro. Would you like me to say anything else about the poem, or is that sufficient in itself? Yes.
And if you can give me a copy of the work, then it can be added.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
The older I get, the more I become convinced that really there is only poetry. So I began with a challenging, not to say in some parts obscure poem by Edwin Muir, called The Incarnate One. And I'm going to finish by also sharing a poem by Edwin Muir. I think this is a little less grim, this one. And it's called The Place of Light and Darkness. Walking on the harvest hills of night, time's elder brother, the great husbandman, goes on his ancient rounds. His massive lantern, simpler than the first fashion, lights the rows of stooks that look like little golden graves or tasselled barges foundering low in the black stream. He sees that all is ready. The trees all stripped, the orchards bare, the nests empty, all things grown homeless and whole. He sees the hills of grain, a day all yellow and red, flowers, fruit, corn, the soft hair harvest golden in darkness, children playing in the late night black day of time. He sees the lover standing by the trysting tree, who'll never find his love till all are gathered in light and darkness. The unnumbered living, numbered and bound and sheaved. Oh, could that day break on this side of time? A wind shakes the loaded sheaves. The feathery tomb bursts open, and yellow hair is poured along the ground from the bent neck of time. The woods cry, "This is the resurrection." Oh, little judgment days lost in the dark, seen by the bat and screech owl. He goes on, bearing within his ocean heart the jewel, the day all yellow and red, wherein a sun shines on the endless harvest lands of time. I would like to propose or suggest that you might like to go into small groups and spend a bit of time sharing where you see the loveliness that's everywhere. Perhaps particularly in the harder places.